Guys, welcome back to another episode of Get Your Popcorn. I know the podcast is late again. I promise it won't be late this upcoming week. It's been crazy for me, okay guys? So this week we are doing Zodiac, the 2007 David Fincher movie. I feel like an extremely underrated film. It is so good and kind of just flew under the radar in 2007 for whatever reason. The first time I saw this film was when I watched it in a forensic class I took in high school. We had to watch it, which is just an interesting choice given the fact that this is very much circumstantial evidence and a lot of this stuff and not really anything to do with like actual forensics. But anyway, that's where I watched it first, was forensic science. It's an amazing film and is often kind of forgot about. So I thought it'd be a good one. Along the same lines as JFK, it was one of those movies where I started to watch it and then realized there's so much information in the film that you have to watch, and I can't physically like print out all the evidence or we'd be here all day. So you guys are going to have to bear with me on this. I'll do my best, but there is a lot of information to pick through, and I kind of had to weed out what was like absolutely necessary for me to kind of move forward through the plot without getting into the like literally explaining word for word from the script, which has kind of been a problem in the last few movies that I've done. So we'll get into pre-production. So this is based on a book by a real person. All this is based on the real Zodiac killings that took place in the 60s and the 70s in the San Francisco Bay Area, Northern Southern California. I am not going to deep dive into the Zodiac murderers. Essentially, what we need to know for the purpose of reviewing this film is that the Zodiac murders went unsolved, and there was a mix of couples and women and shootings and stabbings that were all related, they believed, and the Zodiac killer heavily contacted the media. It was very involved. It was very sensationalized. And it was in this period where there was a lot of chat about serial killers and this huge rise in like identification and public awareness of serial killers through the 70s in this time period. So essentially, like, that's what the movie is based on. It's based on this real book by Robert Graysmith, and then all the characters in the movie are real people. The legitimacy of the movie in terms of accuracy is very a Hollywood version. Essentially, what had happened is David Fincher, when he came onto the project, really wanted to insist that everything was as accurate as possible in terms of the information they were given from eyewitnesses, primary sources, from the actual letters of the Zodiacs themselves, and from the evidence. However, this is a Hollywood movie, so some of the stuff that was like not necessarily fabricated but embellished, let's say, were the relationships between the two characters, particularly Jake Gyllenhaal's character of Robert Graysmith and Robert Downey Jr.'s character of Paul Avery, the two people that work at the San Francisco Chronicle. The movie makes them look so they were a lot closer than they were. Anyway, so kind of take this with a grain of salt, right? Like, we are being given a narrative by the guy that wrote the book. So we're following his narrative. And I think what's important to remember about Robert Graysmith, and you'll find over the course of this film, because the theme of this film essentially is obsession and madness, is that it's that classic like Sherlock Holmes theory. Like, are you twisting facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts? Once you kind of get in the weeds, it's really hard to see your way out. So through the course of this film, you'll kind of see that. But I think it's important when we're going through some of the information on the case, we don't just watch the movie and go, yep, that's what happened. You got to use your critical thinking skills a little bit through this, which is something upon my first viewing, because the first time I watched this movie, I was 16, I think, and it just wasn't that good. So I thought, you know, this is hard. This is very much like the JFK case, I think. Presentation of criminal activity through film is often like, obviously we're going to get like one narrative of it, and a lot of the times when we're reading these books of people that were deep within the case, or in the case of Robert Graysmith, his perception of being deep within the case, although he was not obviously an investigator, he's a cartoonist, as we'll learn, you know, you're following what they've decided is the truth. So although this is based a lot on like what they were able to find, it is important to remember who our primary sources are in terms of this and whether or not they are stable narrators. So the screenwriter who developed this, his name's James Vanderbilt, and he actually read the book in high school and became very fascinated with, and he wanted to read the screenplay. And 10 years later, the rights became available. and he was able to do it. And he had to, in order for him to get the rights from Robert Graysmith, he had to promise him that it would be like very true to life. And this is the quote that he said: "I can promise if I do it, it will be R-rated, it will take place in a real time period, and the Zodiac won't get caught." David Fincher was the first choice to direct this, but he was unavailable because he was attached to The Black Dahlia, which was supposed to be a miniseries. That ultimately fell through due to some financing issues, and then he was signed on to The Zodiac. David Fincher was very interested in this as he was a kid in the area where the Zodiac killed. And so this was weighed heavily on his mind through his childhood. So he was very interested and felt he could bring something to it. Like I said, he had a very strong desire for them to make the film as accurately as possible, using police reports, eyewitnesses, investigators, along with primary sources. And here's a quote from him: "Even when we did the interviews, we would talk to two people. One person would confirm some aspects and another would deny it. Plus, so much time had passed, memories affected, and different telling of the stories would change perception. So when there was doubt, we always went with the police reports." And then they also hired experts to review the documents, including all the letters. Go over the cast. So we've got Jake Gyllenhaal as the title role of Robert Graysmith. He's a cartoonist who works for the San Francisco Chronicle. We've got Mark Ruffalo as Inspector Dave Tachi, I believe. We've got Robert Downey Jr. as Paul Avery. We have Anthony Edwards as Inspector Bill Armstrong. We have Brian Cox as Melvin Belly. We have Charles Flesher as Bob Vaughn. We have Zach Greiner as Mel Nicola. We have Philip Baker Hall as Sherwood Morrell. We have John Carroll Lynch as Arthur Lee Allen. We have Chloe Sevigny as Melanie Gray Smith. There is so many people in this cast. It's a big cast, so I'm not going to go through all of them. But that is the cast. Obviously, this is an excellent cast, sort of pre-Avenger for Mark Ruffalo and Robert Downey Jr. They're both good in it. This is another, Robert Downey Jr. is always best when he's playing some version of himself. And this is a very Robert Downey Jr. role. He is himself. He is Robert Downey Jr. Instead of drugs, we've got alcoholism. He's great, but it's kind of a easy setup for him. Jake Gyllenhaal is really good in this. Mark Ruffalo is very good, although I don't feel like any of these are particularly super challenging parts to play. The emotional range isn't insane that they need to have. I think what is spectacular about the film is the direction, because the tone of this film, for a very information-heavy film, is very gripping. David Fincher really drags you down into this world of obsession and drags you down into the case of the Zodiac, and right down with Robert Graysmith are you going. So it's David Fincher's direction style, I believe, that really make this film shine. So this film, like I said, really went under the radar. It was a box office bomb. It made $84 million on an $85 million budget. David Fincher blamed the marketing. To quote, he said, "Even with the box office being what it was, I still think there was an audience out there for this movie. Everyone had a different idea about the marketing. But my philosophy is that if you market a movie to 16-year-old boys and don't deliver Saw, they're going to be the most ferocious ones coming out of the screenplay saying, this movie sucks. And you're saying goodbye to the audience that would get it because they're going to look at the ads and say, I don't want to watch a slasher movie." Which is, I think, and probably a pretty accurate assessment of what happened. Critics loved this movie. It got 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's got a 4.0 on Letterboxd. And the Guardian paper gave it 4 out of 5 stars, saying it's impossible not to enjoy Zodiac. If enjoy is the word for a picture so often scary and stomach churning, certainly isn't boring. Despite a mammoth 2.5-hour runtime, Fincher's feel for detail is terrific. The chewed pencils, typewriters, and clunky telefax machines are all very real. There's some bizarre moments that are so absurd they could only come from real life. Roger Ebert, who you guys all know is my favorite, gave it 4 out of 4, saying, "The film is a police procedural cross with a newspaper movie, but is free of most cliches of either. It is impressive accomplishment is to gather the bewildering labyrinth of facts and suspicion over a period of years and make the journey through this maze frightening and suspenseful." So usually we have a lot more awards to go through, but no Academy Award nominations for Zodiac, but it made 25 critics' top 10 list of the year. So without further ado, guys, let's get into plot. It starts off in July 1969. A couple is shot on Lover's Lane. Arlene Farron and Mike Mayhew. The Zodiac reports the call. This is done brilliantly. We see this couple, they're driving up to sort of a Lover's Lane, and the way this entire film is lit is phenomenal. Like the cinematography and everything in this film is so good. But the way it's done is we're operating in a lot of backlighting and half shadows, so you can't really totally see what's going on. And so it's really eerie because you feel like you would if you were sitting in the car with Darlene and Mike. You can't really tell what's going on. The Zodiac drives up behind them and they're backlit. We can only see parts of their faces in shadow, and it's really unnerving. You hear the sounds of where the guy would be, but you can't see him directly, as though you're really sitting in the car with them. It really adds to the whole ambience of the film. And they do this all throughout the film. The film is lit as though you are really standing there and not as though you're watching a film of characters do something. So if they're doing a night shot, you can't really see. Like if it's just a street light that is lighting them, then that's the way that they've chosen to light the scene. It's very effective. The next month, the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper gets a letter from the Zodiac. It also gets a coded letter saying that if they don't crack this code, that he's going to kill 12 people. And if the message is cracked, it'll reveal his identity. So when they get it, the big bosses of the newspaper and a lot of the reporters are debating whether or not it's ethical to print it, including their crime reporter, which is Paul Avery. He contacts the police department and confirms that the other papers also got it, and that this is a valid letter. We also meet Robert Graysmith, who's a cartoonist, and he is extremely interested in what is happening and completely abandons his cartoon that he's working on and try to kind of weasel his way in there. Robert puts in his 2 cents that he believes that the killer's identity is not going to be in the letter, but he's completely brushed off by Paul Avery. It is not included on the further discussions of the killings with the rest of the editors. So Robert decides he's going to take a photo of the letter that was set aside, and he takes it home with him. The newspaper publishes the code, and then it's then cracked by a couple. He was correct. No identity was revealed. Avery then comes to Graysmith's desk, introduces himself. Graysmith lets him know that they've actually been working together for 9 months. And Avery says, "You were right. The killer did not give his name." In September, the Zodiac stabs 2 more people, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. The Zodiac finds them at a public park. He gives a little bit of details about himself as he's tying them up. I believe this was actually shot at the murder site. They had to change and re-add some landscape and stuff to make it look as though it did. That was what I've heard on some sort of secondary sources. So that's not true. It's not true, but that was on some of my research what I had found. But you know the internet, guys. I do my best. And this is really jarring. It's really and this is another one that's very effectively done, where the Zodiac kind of creeps up on them, ties them up. It's very graphic. They don't do anything to try and make it look pretty or cinematic. It's really graphic and disturbing. The Zodiac again calls the police to report his own murders. The girl then dies 2 days later. There's then another letter that is sent that Graysmith is actually able to crack. Paul Avery is very impressed with this, and they kind of begin to work together. They find a reference in the letter that's from a 1930s movie called The Most Dangerous Game, which is about a man who hunts humans. We then cut to this really cool overhead shot as we're kind of following a cab driver around on his route, and we hear the radio playing with the reports of the Zodiac killings. And then we kind of finish the cab driver's route where he's about to drop somebody off, and then the cab driver is shot and killed. Police are called to what they believe initially is a robbery, and the initial reports is it was a robbery completed by a black man. When the 2 police officers arrive, that's Bill Armstrong and Dave Tochi, they discovered that the cab driver has actually been murdered. There's a family with some kids who were witnesses to it, and it was a woman who called in to report what she believed was a robbery. They give a description of a white male with a crew cut and glasses who walks with a bit of a kind of like a limp. The Zodiac then mails a letter saying that he's going to be targeting schools and kill the little darlings and blow up school buses. And he admits to killing the cab driver. We then see more of Robert Graysmith continue to try and be involved with the details. His obsession is starting to grow. We see him take his kid to the school bus and then sort of process what's going on. And then it was like, no, never mind, I'll drive you. The police departments kind of begin to work together, and they discover Dave Tochi discovers that there was a military boot print left at one of the scenes, but they are finding it difficult to communicate because this is, of course, late 60s, early 70s. You can't just scan documents and send it off in an email, right? Like, like even if there are fax machines, like, not all the offices have them, so they're having to use like snail mail for stuff. So it's proven very difficult, and this is why it was a lot easier for criminals to get away with stuff before this. They didn't have the same data processing analysis, but they also just like physically, it was just like much more difficult to send evidence back and forth. And then of course with no centralized database. So Armstrong and Tochi, they interviewed 2 beat cops who saw the killer right after the shooting but didn't stop him because the initial reports were that the killer was black. So they let this guy who looked totally suspicious, who would have been covered in blood, walk past them because they thought, no, we need to arrest a black guy. So Avery and Graysmith continue to discuss the case a ton. That seems to be more what Graysmith is doing at work than his actual cartooning. They do some really cool cuts where it's like pickup shots back and forth where Graysmith and Avery will be discussing the case, and then they immediately switch over to Armstrong and Tochi discussing like the same facts of the case and back and forth. The Zodiac then calls the police and says that he's going to local morning show, and the police are coaching the host, Melvin Belly, about what to do, and that they need to keep him on the line for 15 minutes to trace a call. So all the characters are watching on TV. This is a big thing that's happening, and the Zodiac calls. The host asks him about his health, and he says he has headaches and hangs up. Then Melvin Belly, because this is all televised, says, we're not tracing your calls. We are not capable of that kind of stuff. The Zodiac then calls back and says he doesn't want to go to the gas chamber. Screaming's heard in the background. The Zodiac says he has a headache. He screams, and then that he's going to hang the kids. He screams that he's going to kill the kids. Hangs up. He agrees he's going to meet with the TV host. The analysts don't think it's him. They believe it's a mental patient that's been calling, and then one of the operators says that the voice is not hers because she was one of the 911 operators when the Zodiac reported the first shooting. Another letter is sent to the Chronicle, and Graysmith sneaks in on the meeting. Avery then invites Grayson out for a drink, and they discuss code cracking, and they both get very, very drunk. The Zodiac then sends a letter to Melvin Belly, and apparently has also been trying to contact via phone. We then cut to a scene with a woman and her baby. This scene is so eerie. It was a really, really hard watch for me. So she's broken down. She's got some car troubles. A man pulls over to help. She needs to be taken to the next fuel station. She grabs her baby and she gets in the car. And they are driving. And the guy drives past the next fuel station, and then she's getting really creeped out, and she's like, okay, you need to stop, you need to turn around. And then he tells her he's going to throw her baby out the window. We then cut again back to the highway to a woman screaming in the middle of the road in a pulled over semi-truck, and like the floodlights are all we see, and we see just sort of the shadows, and she's screaming, and the police come. And she's hidden her baby on the side of the road in case the Zodiac, what is perceived to be the Zodiac, at least at this point, comes back. It's very, very disturbing. The Zodiac sends more letters. Paper continues to print them. He admits that the girl in the car was him, that he did that. Graysmith begins to pick apart every letter with Avery, and they connect the dots that the Zodiac is claiming to have done murders that have already been printed in the paper. They also find the connection between the Zodiac symbol that he keeps leaving at the bottom of the letters and a symbol of the Zodiac wristwatch, which I believe is like a Swiss watch or something. I don't know that much about watches. So the police, in order to stop what they think either might be copycat letters or, sensationalizing, tell them to stop printing the letters from Zodiac. Avery then continues to get much more paranoid, and he buys a gun. We see then Graysmith get set up on a blind date. It doesn't seem to be going that well. He discusses the Zodiac, and he discusses Avery, that he's very worried about him. And so he decides that he's going to wait up all night for Avery to call him back because he's so concerned, and this blind date ends up waiting next to him. I definitely wouldn't have done that. Avery eventually calls, and he says that the Riverside Police Department. Avery then does call Graysmith and realizes he's put together another connection. And he announces on TV that the killer may have been active longer than they thought. And he announces this on TV instead of saying this to Armstrong and Tochi, which makes him extremely mad. They then go to the police department that Avery was talking to, and the police give them the letters, but they don't believe they're Zodiac. We then see Avery and Tochi get into an argument, basically being like, well, you're not doing anything about solving the case. And another one being like, well, you're not doing anything. You're just printing it in the paper, making it worse, and yada, yada, yada. The police are then bombarded with false reports and confessions, but one lead is promising that had been reported a couple of times. It's an old fishing buddy of a guy named Arthur Lee Allen, who was fired from his school for molestation. So then we cut to 1971, and Tochi and Armstrong go to question Arthur Lee Allen as a suspect in the Vallejo case, which is the Darlene Farron is the name of the victim. Arthur Lee Allen admits to saying that he had already been interviewed by another officer, and he's extremely suspicious immediately, just so suspicious. He says he saw, and he's like admitting things that like you didn't need to, like just throwing in facts of the case left and right and just giving excuses before they're even asking him where he was that day. So he clearly knows the details and the who, what, when, where, why of the Zodiac. So he says he saw a couple at the lake that day that those two were stabbed because he was skin diving, but he was back by 4. His neighbor saw him. But then his neighbor died of a heart attack, so he's not going to be able to confirm. He admits he had knives in his car that day, but it was because he was carving up chicken for dinner. He admits he was near Riverside, and then he says, I'm not the Zodiac, and if I was, I certainly wouldn't tell you. He then admits that The Dangerous Game is his favorite book, and he thinks that's why they're there, because he told that to the fishing buddy. Here's a quote, "The most dangerous game. That's why you're here, isn't it? It was my favorite book in high school. It's about this man who waits for these people to get shipwrecked on this island because he's tired of hunting animals, and he hunted the people for the challenge. And man is the most dangerous animal of all." It's David Toshi. And Arthur Lee Allen says that's the whole point of the story. And they notice that he's wearing a Zodiac wristwatch. So Tochi thinks this is a lock, that he's the killer. And they also interview his brother and sister-in-law, who basically say, yeah, we'll search his place the next time we're there. Like, they don't outrule that he's, like, disturbing. I mean, obviously, he was fired from a school for molesting children. Like, this guy's handwriting experts, however, don't believe Allen did it. His handwriting's not a match. Because of this, they can't issue a search warrant. They don't have not enough like substantial evidence, just a lot of like coincidences. I have to back up. So one very important thing is that Arthur Lee Allen goes by Lee. So then cut to 1 year later. We're seeing the effects of the Zodiac case on everybody around them. It's starting to get pretty intense. We're seeing like the cracks in the psyches essentially of these people. Avery wants to be put in charge exclusively of all Zodiac things in terms of crime reporting. He only wants to work Zodiac. He's denied by his boss. He's drinking heavily. He's inviting people to go out to drink with him at like 10 a.m. Like he's drunk at work stumbling. Arthur Lee Allen's sister-in-law is then interviewed again, saying she hasn't seen him in 9 months because he moved to Santa Rosa, and that he was seeing a social worker for a while, and that she straight up asked him if he was capable of murder. And the social worker said yes. Dave Tochi then tries to get a warrant again. They want new handwriting samples based on some psychological evidence they have, and that he's ambidextrous and they only tested the one hand, and that the original fishing buddy gives a official statement about all the things that he reported. They go into his trailer. It's disgusting. They find a lot of pet squirrels and porn, which is just, they find gloves that looked like the ones at the crime scene. They find the same size boots, and they find the same gun that would have been used. They run all the evidence, but the ballistics from that gun don't match, and the new handwriting samples don't match as well. Tochi's then encouraged to take a break from his boss. We then cut to 4 years later. Avery has moved papers, and Grace and Smith's trying to kind of discuss the case, kind of make a connection with the new crime reporter who kind of blows him off. Tochi's partner, Armstrong, has put in a transfer. He just needs better work-life balance. Grace Smith has married the girl from the blind date, and they have a new baby. And we see that he is deep in his obsession. He has every clipping, every newspaper article, everything about the Zodiac. Grace Smith goes to visit Avery, and we see that he's fallen down a bottomless pit of addiction to both alcohol and drugs. There's Coke and empty bottles everywhere. So Grace Smith is going to him to approach the idea of them kind of revisiting the case by putting together a book and seeing if they can kick around any new information. Paul Avery says, so what's new? Graysmith says, I've been thinking we should write a book. Paul Avery says, somebody should write a fucking book, that's for sure. Paul Avery says, about what? Graysmith says, the Zodiac. Avery says, that's not new. Graysmith says, I've been thinking that if you put all the information together, maybe you could jog something loose. I think it would be the best case. Paul Avery said, yeah, that's true. Graysmith says, and you know all the players and you have all the files. Paul Avery says, lost them. Graysmith says, you lost them? Paul Avery says, or I tossed them. I don't know. I moved onto a boat. You know, we work at daily business, right? As in today. What did you do? What did you think we were doing back then? Do you know more people die in the East Bay commute every 3 months than that idiot ever killed? He offed a few citizens, he wrote a few letters, and then faded into a footnote. Not that I haven't been sitting around here idly waiting for you to drop by and reinvigorate my sense of purpose. It was 4 years ago. Let it fucking go. Graysmith says, you're wrong. It's important. Avery says, then what did you ever do about it if it's so important? What did you do? You hovered over my desk. You stole from my wastebasket. Am I being unkind? Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot. You went to the library. And Graysmith says, I'm sorry I bothered you. We then see a really cool shot of Graysmith going past the site where the taxi cab driver was killed, and then a similar kind of passing of Tochi going the opposite direction, but doing the same sort of thing. So we see these just like, their like constant psyche is just filled with the Zodiac case. Graysmith then contacts Tochi about the case and sort of gains his trust by giving him a bunch of information that he knows and is aware of. And Tochi basically says, I can't say this, but, and then he gives him the names of the other people that he could contact, the other departments. He is able to convince the Vallejo department to let him look through the case files. And he finds out that Darlene the night before had a paint night and she was very afraid of somebody that she knew. And that she had also been receiving like anonymous, mysterious calls of just heavy breathing, and she was quite scared. And this sort of leads him to believe that the Zodiac and her may have known each other. He also interviews the maid, Melvin Belly. She said that she received a phone call from the Zodiac at Marvin Belly's house that she had picked up on December 18th saying that he had to kill somebody. It's my birthday. Graysmith continues to fall deeper and deeper into obsession. His wife is extremely concerned, especially as his investigation is starting to gain a little more notoriety. They published a little bit about it in the Chronicle, but of course he's then developing this book. He receives a phone call saying that from this person that somebody he knows is the Zodiac named Rick Marshall. So Graysmith then gets a call with heavy breathing and nothing happening, and then a hang up. And his wife begins to get scared. He then goes to one of the police captains who believes that Rick Marshall might be the Zodiac, revealing they never had his handwriting analyzed. They gain the samples of the handwriting from a movie theater that he used to work at. It's then analyzed and they said it's similar, but we can't positively identify it. Zodiac then sends another letter to the Chronicle. This time it's investigated by Internal Affairs, and Tochi is accused of forging it in order to reinvigorate interest for the case. Graysmith's life continues to be deeply affected. His wife and him do not share a room anymore. They get into a huge fight, and she's like, well, when is it going to be enough? And Graysmith says, when I look him in the eye and I know that that's him. Graysmith begins to harass Tochi, and Tochi basically says, you know, don't call him, like, this is too much, like, stop. Graysmith then goes to the boss who owned the theater that Rick Marshall worked at, trying to find out more information. They find out the handwriting was the owner's and not Marshall's, but they found out that he ran the Dangerous Game 9 weeks before the first spree of murders, and then this boss really freaks out Graysmith, and he kind of like runs out of there, basically. And this is what I mean. There's part of the are you suiting facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts element, right? Like he's really trying to like jam square pegs in round holes just because he's just so obsessed. And that's really what's scary about this film is although Zodiac stuff is scary, like how quickly somebody can fall into madness from obsession. So Graysmith comes home and his wife and kids are gone. His wife has left him. Graysmith then goes to visit one of Darlene's friends. This is like the original from the Lover's Lane shooting. And Graysmith says, tell me about the painting party. And Linda, the friend, says, I told the cops about this a long time ago. Darlene always had boys around even though she was married. This one guy was really weird though. He used to bring her presents from Tijuana. I don't know why she was friends with him. She once told me he killed somebody. Graysmith says, really? Linda says, I think he was in the service. Robert, Navy? Linda, I think so. Robert, was he into movies? Was he a movie buff? Linda says, I can tell you he was not into people. The party that Darlene threw, people were just supposed to show up, drink beer, help paint. But this guy showed up in a suit and just sat in a chair all by himself all night and didn't talk to anyone. And Darlene told me to stay away from him. She was scared of him, and a couple of weeks later, she was dead. And Robert says, I'm sorry, do you remember his name? Linda said, it was short, like Stan. Robert says, Rick? And Linda says, no, I don't think so. Robert, are you sure? Linda, yeah. Robert, how can you be sure? It was a long time ago. Think hard. Linda, I am thinking hard. Robert says, Rick, it was Rick. Say it. And Linda says, it wasn't Rick. And Linda says, it was Lee. And Graceman stopped. Lee. And she said, yeah, Lee. Lee sounds right. And this triggers something in the files for Grayson that he remembers, and he runs back to look at them, and it's Arthur Lee Allen that he remembers. So he contacts a current detective who's working on it, and he brushes him off. Zodiac continues to call him. Graysmith then goes to Tochi's house, who basically is like, why the fuck are you showing up at my house, dude? And Robert Graysmith is like banging on the door and like yelling at him through it. And he said, Dave, you made a mistake. The birthday was the one thing that he was weak. It was one time he gave something away. David says, Robert says, Arthur Lee Allen. David Tochi said, where did you get that name? Robert says, December 18th, he called Belly's house. I have to kill. Today is my birthday. It was his birthday. Arthur Lee Allen was born on December 18th. Tochi says, get in here. Tochi reveals that Allen went to prison for molestation for 2 years and contacted him, offering him help with the case when he was out. So this explains the gap between the killings, or the letters, I mean. They go over all the evidence, both circumstantial, and then they go over the timeline. It's quite convincing for their case. Graysmith. This is a case that's covered northern and southern California with the victims and suspects spread over hundreds of miles. Would you agree? Tochi, yeah. Graysmith. Darlene Ferriton worked at the Vallejo House of Pancakes on the corner of Tennessee and Carroll. Arthur Lee Allen lived in his mother's basement on Fresno Street, door to door that's less than 50 yards. Tochi, is that true? Graysmith, I blocked it. Tochi, Jesus Christ. We then cut to 1983. Graysmith goes into a hardware store. He sees Arthur Lee Allen and he says, can I help you? And this is where we get that like callback to, look, I need to look him in the eye and I'll know it's him. And Graysmith is very freaked out and he says no. And then we cut again tonight. This is where the movie wraps up. Graysmith's book has now been published. There's like new interest in the case. A detective has now been assigned. He tracks down Mike Mayhew, who is the man that was shot at the same time as Darlene, but he had survived. And they gave him a lineup of suspects, and he correctly identifies Arthur Lee Allen, saying the last time I saw this face was July 4th, 1969. I'm very sure that's the man who shot me. And then we cut to the title cards. It's the end of the film. It says Arthur Lee Allen, although being identified, died before he could ever be interviewed. In 2002, a partial DNA profile was not a match. In 2004, the case was deactivated by San Francisco. However, it remains open for all other counties. Arthur Lee Allen is still the only suspect in the Vallejo investigation. And this is in 2007. Again, I researched for the purposes of the film. There's lots of resources for the Zodiac killings if you would like to look into that. My only note, of course, with all true crime is not to sensationalize the killings. Always important to remember is the victims. Tochi was cleared of all charges for writing that letter. Paul Avery passed away in 2000, and Graysmith says that he hasn't received any anonymous calls since Arthur Lee Allen's death, but did up until. So that's Zodiac. Some pretty heavy dialogue stuff. I'm going to try and do less case-based stuff because, as I've been working through this, they're incredibly detailed to research. And also, I feel like I'm not coming across as well as I want to in these podcasts just because there's so much information just like slammed in and I have to read out so much dialogue. So next week, we're going to be, and by next week, I mean like 4 days, we're going to be doing Black Panther. So I hope everyone had a really good weekend. And if it's sunny there today, enjoy the sunshine.